Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting, thrilling episode of JavaScript Jabber. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for being a mind, but I'm still your host. Today we have a returning guest plus a new guest. First of all, I'd like to welcome back Misko Hevery. How you doing, Misko?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me again.
Good to have you. This will be a rather quick conversation, so they say. Right?
Womp womp.
Thank you. Ooh. And then also we're welcoming a new guest, Mr. Jack Herrington. How you doing, Jack?
I'm great. How are you?
Fabulous. Nice to have you. So before we get going into our panelists and our subject, why don't you give us a little background on yourself, such as who you are, why you're famous, why people should give you money, etc.
Should I go first or is Jack going first?
Oh, everybody knows you, Misko. We just want to hear about Jack.
Oh, okay. I'm Jack Herrington. I'm a React YouTuber. And I'm doing content full time now. And so that, I guess, is, I don't know if I'm famous. That's why. But I am actually on another podcast that's on this particular network, React Roundup. So you can go check that out, or my YouTube channel. And yeah, you're all right.
Yeah,
all cool
blue
things.
Blue collar
React.
Coder, right?
Right, the blue collar coder. Exactly.
Today it's a blue shirt coder. But,
exactly. Yeah. And it's got a blue collar.
Right, a little blue and white. Actually, Misko, will come back for those who might not be aware of your ever-increasing fame. Why don't you give us a little background on YouTube?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Misko. I guess I'm famous because of this thing called AngularJS and then Angular, and now we're working on a new framework called Qwik, and I'm currently a CTO of Builder.io. Builder.io is a headless visual CMS. The headless part means it's running on your infrastructure, and visual means it's a drag-and-drop editor that you can have using your own components that you build using your own framework, whether it's React, Angular, Vue, or Qwik.
I love that explanation because often when I hear the terms headless and visual together, it kind of throws me off. But you gave an excellent explanation of how these two can work together.
And before we get into that, let's welcome our panelists. Surprisingly quiet until now, AJ O'Neill. How you doing, AJ?
I'm not going to dignify that. Yo, everybody. What's happening? Coming at you live from freaking 95 degrees.
Where?
It's getting hot.
No, where in the U.S. has 95 degrees right now? I'm just curious.
It's
Texas?
Utah.
Oh,
Utah.
Oh, okay.
Utah Valley. The whole valley is heating up. I think today's high is predicted to be 93.
Woohoo!
Whoa, that's more than Tel Aviv.
But in the it was crazy because we had a super long winter. Winter lasted until about 3 weeks ago, and then all of a sudden that's not true. Sorry, we had a really long spring. We had a really late winter and a really long spring, and summer started about 3 weeks ago, and it just got hot. It went from like months of pleasant weather, which is incredibly unusual, to just boom, burning hot.
There you go.
And my AC can't keep up with it in the shed.
And coming at us live from Tel Aviv is Dan Shapir. How you doing, Dan?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. It's not as hot as Utah, surprisingly.
That's a first.
Yeah, no, it's a nice 80-something degrees here in the evening. It's on the warm side, but I'm okay with it, and I've got the AC running, so all's good.
Good. All right. So since we last spoke with Misko, Qwik has had a 1.0 release. Let's see. Sorry, I forgot about the studio audience too. So we're here to talk about what has been going on Qwik since the last episode with 1.0 and any other topics we might rabbit trail into. So Misko, take it away.
Yeah, so 1.0 was in early May, and we're super excited about it. To us, 1.0 means that the APIs of Qwik and Qwik City are stable. We're not planning to change it. Certainly, we're going to be adding new things, but it's all going to be backwards compatible. And so, yeah, we're super excited because it means the world can start using us in production, and we're supporting them. I think since 1.0, we had some cool set of features that came out. One of them is the image optimization. We had image optimization before, but like this is a whole new level of image optimization. And we integrated, one of the philosophy we have with Qwik is that we want to be the performance framework without the developer having to jump through any kind of hoops. So kind of out of the box, just do the right easy thing. The easy thing is the performance thing. And one area where frameworks typically don't have an opinion on is CLS, right? Cumulative layout shift, because that's really a problem with styling rather than a problem with the framework. But with Qwik, we now hook into the Chrome dev and we collect information and we automatically tell you that your code might have a CLS issue. And there's even a button to push, like it comes up in the red box and says like, hey, this thing shifted on page load. Like, did you intend this? You might want to look at it.
Oh, that's slick, man. I mean, okay.
And in the corner, if it's an image, then we say like, hey, it's an image, so it looks like you forgot to do width or height or something like that. And there's a button that says autofix, and we go and change the source code as well.
Wow, that's really cool.
Nice.
That's really nice.
Right. You can do the same thing for custom fonts?
Yeah, I think we're looking into custom fonts right now. And of course, we integrated Panda CSS, and I started using it. I absolutely love it. It's like Emotion, but without kind of some of the drawbacks that Emotion has with server-side rendering.
So when you say integrated it, what does that mean? Does that mean like it's now you have to use Panda, or?
No, it's you could use whatever CSS technology you want, but now it's integrated in. So one of the choices you can use Tailwind, you can use Post CSS, you can use Vanilla Extract. Now we have an additional one called Panda, and it's a atomic CSS based system. So it's kind of like Tailwind in that sense, but it doesn't have the what's the word I'm looking for? The thing that makes Tailwind controversial, right? The thing that
the bloat of like your classes and your class name. Yeah.
The controversial part is not included inside of that.
So I was actually not so familiar with Panda CSS before you mentioned it to me. When we last spoke. So can you maybe? And I'm assuming that if it's true for me, it's also probably true for some of our listeners. So even though we're here to talk about Qwik, can you tell us a little bit about Panda CSS and why is it worthwhile to use this technology? What's interesting about it?
Yeah. So first of all, let me just preface it with I am not a styling expert. Okay.
Who is? Just leave a room. That's it.
I can barely center a text. Okay.
Nobody. Well.
Oh yeah. No, hold on. So horizontally, that's easy, but vertically,
nobody can center text vertically.
Anyways, okay. So what's cool about Panda CSS? I think CSS has gone through a couple of iterations, and I think Emotion JS or Emotion CSS, I don't know what the proper name is, I think became popular because it's the styling inside of your code. And I think there is something to be said for I am coding, I made my div, and now I need to style it. And I can just do it inline. I don't have to make a separate file and then figure out what do I name the file? And it just breaks the flow, right? If you want to center something, to go through making a new CSS file and then importing it into it and then referring to it and giving it a name, it's just too much work. And so there is something to be said for this niceness of just inlining the styling directly into your source code. And I think that's the reason why Emotion has become so popular.
I think, if I can interject, I think there's a kind of a disconnect or kind of impedance mismatch between developers and designers, where developers have been trained to look at things locally and encapsulate things and componentize things, whereas designers often looked at things holistically and globally and across the entire scope of the page. And CSS is originally more modeled to the designer outlook. And we developers keep struggling with that. How do I put my rules specifically on the component? How do I encapsulate my layout and stuff like that? And I think this is a recurring issue, and that's kind of the reason I think at the end of the day, there are other technical reasons, but at the end of the day, it seems to me that that's the primary motivation for a lot of these utilities built on top of CSS.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. I want to just add to it is that there are kind of two ways to think about styling, right? There is this atomic CSS, and then there's the classical way of doing CSS. The classical way is like you have a element and you give it a name through a class name, and then inside of the class name you add a bunch of things that what it is. And so when you have a design system, it's very common that everybody has the same padding, padding 10, padding 10, padding 10, right? But normally you keep repeating that everywhere in all your styles, right? Whereas Atomic CSS says, well, how about we break this up and we basically say that, hey, the padding 10 is going to be just one style. And then, margin might be another style, or, centering could be another style. And then you just combine those styles, kind of what Tailwind does, right? If you think about it, Tailwind is Atomic CSS because you're saying like, I want padding, I want margin, I want all these things, but it bloats your classes, right? So what Panda is kind of a mixture of both. Like it's atomic like Tailwind, but it's inlined like Emotion. And I think putting those two together is kind of makes it for a really nice combination. And I really enjoy using it.
And I think that Manu recently added some nice integration between you and Panda, I seem to recall. Kind of experimental. Yeah, kind of experimental, but really cool.
That's right. And so the kind of the niceness of Atomic CSS is that the amount of CSS kind of grows, but it kind of reaches a plateau no matter how big your app gets, right? There's like a plateau that you reach because you've already, specified the padding once, you specified the margin, and you already have the so on. And so it's a limited in kind of in scope.
And does it also kind of avoid the problem of adding rules that you can then never remove because you don't know what you might break?
Right. So Panda CSS is a compile time thing. So Emotion is runtime, right? Like as the code is running, it's generating the styles, and that creates problems for server-side rendering and things of that sort. And adding and removing the rules can cause styling reflows. Whereas Panda CSS basically executes all these things statically ahead of time during the compilation and sets up all the styles ahead of time. And then the only thing you're doing is just kind of a Tailwindy thing. So think of it like it's like Tailwind in terms of the runtime, but it's like Emotion in terms of the syntax.
Interesting.
I'm excited.
I like it. I'm really enjoying it.
I'll use Qwik to do it.
There you go.
So what else is new on Qwik?
Let's see. We talked about the styling. One of the things I started working on, we started this thing called Qwiklabs. And Qwiklabs is basically our area where we want to experiment with things, right? Once you reach 1.0, it kind of makes it difficult to experiment because it's like, well, we can't break this, but at the same time, we want to try different things. And so where do you put the things that you want to try? And so for that, we created a brand new package called Qwiklabs. And the idea is that over there inside Qwiklabs, we can experiment. We'll break things. We're not making any sort of guarantees, but we're also saying like, this is not production ready. This is just for us to kind of try and get feedback on. And then at some point, it will graduate from Qwiklabs into the actual production code base.
Or not.
So we have two things, or not. It could be dead end, right? And so we have two things going on in there right now. One is the type route, strongly typed routes. The goal,
yeah.
The goal I would like to have is that when you make links or URLs or anything of that sort, like I want the TypeScript to scream at you and be like, that's not a thing that points to anything, right? But not just about URLs, but also query parameters, kind of like React Router from 10stack.
Yeah, we actually had Tanner Lindsay on the show a couple of episodes back talking about it and explaining the benefits of type routing. So if our listeners are interested, they should go back and listen for sure.
So I think what he's trying to do I think he's totally on the right track, and I really support his work. So we want to have the same kind of an idea within Qwik. There are reasons why we can't just use 10stack. I would love to be able to just use it, but it doesn't like decompose into the quickness of lazy loading, etc. Like the 10stack kind of implies that it's running client-side rendered rather than this server client metaphor that Qwik has. And so we want to be able to do all of these things inside of it. So that's one Qwiklabs project.
So just to clarify, in case that does graduate, does that mean that type routing will become the de facto standard routing mechanism for Qwik/Qwik City?
Yeah, going forward, we would add that. Yeah.
Cool.
That's exactly the idea. I mean, I've always been a big proponent of TypeScript. I think TypeScript is great. Big fan of it, right? I think Angular helped. I'm not saying we should take a lot of credit, but like we did a little bit to help popularize it.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Which by adding it into Angular early on before it was that popular.
Yeah, everybody was kind of surprised that like the big project that implemented Microsoft's TypeScript was Google's Angular kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think it was totally the right thing to do. Like in retrospect, it was absolutely right.
Oh yeah, not implement Angular in Dart.
Why did you have to go there?
I like Dart, but yeah, okay.
Dart is fine as a language. It's
the language is
not
great.
Yeah, it's not. Anyways, moving on. So the other thing in Qwiklabs, which I'm super excited about right now, is what we call insights. And insight is stuff that we have talked about for a while that we wanted to do, but now it's actually in there. And the idea of insights is that as you're using the application, we collect statistical information about which symbols are getting loaded when, and we send it back to some database. And then inside of the database, we then analyze it and basically tell you like, what are the ideal bundles? How should you set up your bundles so that you would have the least amount of code being shipped to the client, but also don't have any latency delay for the end user. And the insights will give you not just that, but also tell the system like which components even make it to the client and which components never make it to the client. Right? So like there's kind of a lot of benefits to it. And so that project is underway, and I'm super excited. We have all kinds of visualizations that show off, how the histograms to show off the different latency of different symbols, and then correlation matrices that like say like, oh, it looks like whenever this symbol shows up, also these other symbols also come up, and so tricks like that.
Is that actually out there? I mean, can I try this today? Because that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's inside of Qwiklabs. You can certainly try it.
Heck yeah.
I can send you some links. To show you what the kind of the UI kind of looks like. The UI is not very pretty right now because I said I don't know styling.
He's a Misko special, huh? Okay.
So
I really like
the
it.
idea. I like run my E2E tests against the app, basically, and then at the end, like, whoa, look, okay, we didn't need that.
Yeah. So, but not just E2E, but also like production as well. Like you can just run production application.
Yeah.
And so since we're already collecting this, we're also going to collect any kind of errors that happen on on a client and ship it to the server as well. And the idea is that like, there's one question you can be like, well, what's the set of bundles? There's a separate question you can have, which is like, what are, in which order should these bundles be actually downloaded, right? Because maybe this first bundle contains the buy button and you kind of want to make sure that thing works first. Whereas these other things are, less important. And so you can mix and match all of this information and provide this to the application that's running, and so you can get a much better output, right?
Yeah, slicing and dicing bundles has always been kind of challenging, coming up with the ideal bundle size, because if the bundle is too small, you're losing out on compression. On the other hand, if the bundles are too big, you're potentially losing out on cache invalidations. There are all sorts of challenges with coming up with ideal bundle size. So if you can like optimize both the bundle sizes, what actually gets bundled together, the order in which things get downloaded, and again, offload that effort off of the developers, make it kind of something that developers get, free of charge, as it were, then yeah, that's definitely a very good thing.
I'm actually I want to talk to him about the bundle thing, because I thought the whole point of Qwik was that you didn't actually run bundles or didn't download bundles until you needed them.
Go for it.
This is something that I've been wondering about for years. It seems like we create all this sophistry for exactly the audience that shouldn't be dealing with it. The people that are doing web dev should not be doing this is more of a infrastructure thing in my mind. We should have web servers. This should just be standard in web servers, that there's some sort of statistical analysis that it does a genetic algorithm to serve to a few different browsers, see what the actual use looks like, store that in a tiny amount of RAM, write it out to a cache file, and then when you update the page when any of the resources change, just break the caches and then start with a best guess again.
So I'll make a comment about this because something like 3 years ago, we actually had Yoav Weiss from Google, who works on like infrastructure things at Google, talking about web bundles, as I recall. And there was like this sort of a push to make this sort of a thing part of the actual infrastructure. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. It couldn't happen. There are all sorts of issues. You can't even get everything from all the CDN providers yet. They don't all support, prioritization properly and stuff like that. And you're talking about way more sophisticated things. There are some advances in the infrastructure. For example, like sharing the compression dictionary means that we'll get much better compression with smaller bundles going forward. So you won't have to bundle as much. So the platform is moving forward, but obviously it's moving forward at a slower pace than people like Qwik and Misko can move at.
I want to add to it a little bit, which is that there's a lot of things you can do in terms of optimizing things in general, but your life of optimization is going to be much, much easier if the developer is in on it. What I mean by that is like, if the developer does things to help you along, then your life just gets tremendously simpler, right? And so I think the philosophy that Qwik has is that like out of the box, we want to make sure that we set up a set of rules that force the developer to write the code in such a way so that we have all these options for optimization, right? And I think this is the kind of the big difference with existing approaches, is that existing approaches basically say like, we will somehow magically optimize later. We don't know how, to be determined, right? And of course, then afterwards, they're having a really hard time because like, it's, the developer is not in on it, right? And so I think the big thing or the big innovation here in Qwik is that like we set out a set of rules and the developer doesn't really have to think about it in terms of like, oh, I need to do this because I have to whatever so that it can be optimized, right? These rules are just there and they have to follow them. And because of that, later on you get benefits.
Can you give an example of such a rule that you force developers to follow?
Yeah, so it comes down to, in my opinion, to three things. The most obvious rule is the $sign, right? The $sign is the code extraction. Basically, it is a place where we can now do lazy loading. And with that lazy loading rule comes the fact that whatever we are going to lazy load will require to have serialization of the state, right? And so this $sign is that really, really, I don't know if I want to use the word strict, but there is this rule that is pervasive to the whole system, and the developer has to be in on it. Every time they see a $sign, there are certain rules that they have to follow. But in return, what they get is they don't have to think about bundling. They don't have to think about lazy loading. They don't have to think about startup performance, etc. So I think it's a good trade-off.
So again, can you give a rule that they need to follow with regard to the $sign?
Oh, sorry. The rule would be like whatever your $sign usually comes together with a closure. And the rule is that if it's a closure, then all of the things that closures capture, because closures captures variables outside of them, right? All of those things have to be serializable. That's the rule.
What is not serializable?
A class would not be serializable.
Functions.
Right? Well, functions are in Qwik, right? Because functions, as long as they're wrapped in the $sign, they can be serialized.
Right. But just random one-off functions, though.
Random functions cannot be, but as long as you wrap the function in a $sign, then that becomes serializable, right?
Yeah.
So other things would be like a stream, like WebSocket. Well, that's not serializable, right? But many things are like, we go out of the way to kind of serialize everything. So we can serialize basic objects, hash maps, sets, promises. So most things are serializable.
And what happens if there's something in the closure which is not? You get like a compiler error or something like that?
Yeah, so we have both a ESLint that tries to tell you immediately as part of the compilation by using the type information of TypeScript. The ESLint can basically say like, I don't think that's going to work because the type of that object that you're trying to serialize is not one of those types that we know how to handle. But there's also a runtime error that basically says like if you kind of skip over the TypeScript error by putting an any on it, so to speak, right? The runtime will kind of scream at you and be like, hey, I tried to serialize this thing, it didn't work.
And I think it's worthwhile to clarify to our listeners what we mean by serialization in this context. It means that something can usually start its life cycle on the server, and then at some point or another cross the network divide to the client and continue running there.
That's the kind of a thing, right? And so I usually talk about it in terms of a unified execution model, right? That you don't have to think about where your application is executing. Like it starts its life on a server and then it transitions to executing on a client, and it's all seamless. And you as a developer don't have to like think about it, right? Like I just build my app. The app is executing inside of the constraints of the framework. And so I'm just building it as I normally would. And the fact that some of it executes on a server and some of it executes on a client, that's an implementation detail of the framework, not something you have to worry about as a developer.
I mean, but again, you wrap it in the dollar and follow the rules.
Yeah, there are rules, right? Every framework has the rules.
Yeah,
but again, it's not just that. It's not just about isomorphic code. It's not just about the same code can run on the server or run on the client, or run first on the server and then run on the client. It's about the state that you had when you ran on the server persisting as you run on the client.
Yeah, so I think the way to talk about it is that you can instantiate a closure on a server, but execute it on the client, right? An isomorphic code means like, oh, you have same code that you can run on the server and run on the client. That's not really that exciting. I mean, it's exciting, but not that exciting.
Not super exciting.
But the fact that you can allocate a closure on a server and then execute it on the client, that is kind of a mind warp, right? And the reason why this is important is because what you want is that as part of the server execution, you are allocating closures for the click listeners, right? Or for any kind of listeners in general. And so you want to allocate those closures as part of SSR, but then execute them on a client as part of an interaction.
Which kind of gives me back to it kind of gives me back to where I was thinking right after you mentioned bundle optimization was, I mean, the whole point of Qwik is to have like super small bundles. It's the fine-grained updating thing that we saw in Solid combined with this resumability. And so you don't expect to have mega bundles in Qwikland. Everything's going to be these tiny little things that are dynamically loaded whenever you hit a button or preloaded or whatever. So why any interest at all in bundle optimization?
I think there's, I think to really have a good idea of what bundles are needed to be run on the client versus server, you kind of have to observe the application actually running. There's heuristics you can do and kind of guess, but nothing beats the actual observation, right? I mean, the fundamental problem of tree shakers today is that they have to assume that if a particular if branch is present, then it might be executed, right?
Right.
Sure, they can do tricks where they can look at it and like, oh, all of the variables inside of the if are global and they're constant, therefore I can make an assumption. But generally, that's not the case. So, for example, you could have a third-party library that basically says, oh, if JPEG then run this path, if PNG run this path, right? But let's say your application doesn't have any JPEGs. It all PNGs all the way, right? That JPEG code is coming whether you like it or not because the tree shaker cannot remove it. It statically does not know that you don't have any JPEGs, right?
And here's an interesting architectural or implementation, I don't know at which level to put it, distinction between what you guys are doing and what the React guys with React Server Components seem to be doing. That they are really intentionally trying to enforce a really clear separation between the server-only code and the client code, with the whole use client and use server and having it in separate files, and an import that you can put in that intentionally breaks if you accidentally try to download to the client something that should only live on the server, or conversely, if you put stateful hooks in server-only components and so on and so forth. And you seem to be trying to avoid or trying to not make these kind of distinctions. Like I believe, write all of the Qwik, an entire Qwik application, if I really wanted to, as a single file, more or almost. And so the question that becomes, maybe why? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think so obviously we believe, I mean, our opinion, our point of view is that it's nice to be able to just throw everything in a single file and not having to think about it, right? There is a cost to asking the developer to separate things out. But there's also a cost in, like, you could accidentally put a bunch of things together that you didn't intend to, right? And so these two things needed to be trade off against each other. But in order to put everything into a single file, you need to have some kind of code extraction. Basically, on the end of the day, the answer is it has to be in a separate files, right? It cannot execute as a single file. So the fact that you enable the end user to put everything in a single file means that you have to have some kind of a step which separates things out, right? And so the React approach is basically saying, like, hey, since at the end of the day we have to separate things out anyways, why don't we just force the developer to separate things out for us, right, explicitly? But because we have this ability to do code extraction later on, we actually came a step further and said, we actually think it's not worth for the developer to make these choices. Like, it's better if they don't have to think about it. So they can just put everything together and we will separate things out as needed. Now, it creates complexities such as the need to be then solved through the insights, right? Because you explicitly, in one world, you explicitly say what's client, what's server. In here, we're like, well, we'll profile it, see how it runs, and based on that, we'll decide what's client, what's server.
So, for example, let's say I'm using some sort. You gave an example of using some sort of an image processing library inside the code. With the Qwik approach, there's a higher potential risk that you will accidentally import or access the library features from code that does need to go to the client and end up pulling the library to the client. That's kind of what I'm reading. And your mechanisms are designed to say, warn you that, hey, you're pulling down code that you might not want to pull down. And even if you do want to pull it down, we'll bundle it in such a way that it will either arrive much later or maybe not even arrive at all.
I think it's a little bit more complicated because, like, on one side, yes, by putting things together, you're increasing the risk. But on the other side, because we have an automatic way of breaking things up, then that decreases the risk, right? And so, like, the question that becomes, like, well, which one is it? Like, is the putting things together producing more risk than automatic breaking things up? I actually think that the automatic breaking things up actually improves the risk, not decreases it, because you could do the wrong thing in existing frameworks like React Server Components and Next.js, etc. And there have been instances where people accidentally included they weren't meant to, right? So this is not like a new problem.
Oh yeah, for sure. I recall a project when I worked at Wix when it turned out that we accidentally downloaded 3 different versions of Moment.js into the client bundle. Yeah, fun times.
Yeah. And they never get, and here's the thing about that. They never get picked up like on the PR, right? They always get picked up 3 months down the line when somebody goes, whoa, wait a second. Our bundle is how big? And then, then it's this whole thing of like trying to figure out when did it happen or what's in there and all that. And so I love this idea of, it's kind of a DevOpsy thing of like, hey, it's in your face all the time. It's like, you get this update. It's like, hey, whoa, what you just did brought a lot of code in, by the way. But right now.
But I do have to ask about this. I mean, obviously, you can analyze the user code within the context of the project that's been built in Qwik, because, as you said, there's like an onus on the developer to put in the $ signs and whatnot. But if I'm Yeah, but if I'm bringing in a third-party library via NPM, what then?
Well, that third-party library is referred to from a Qwik handler or from some $ somewhere, right? And so they indirectly get the benefit as well. So if you don't click the button that needs to use the moment.js, whatever, then the moment.js doesn't show up, right? It's only when you actually activate a piece of code that actually needs it, it's only then when the code kind of shows up. And so there is this kind of a trade-off, right? Like on one side, by putting things together, it appears as if you're increasing the risk. But because there's automatic breakup that's happening underneath it, my argument is that the automatic breakup actually in the end produces a lower risk than if you had it.
Yeah, but there's still a risk that when I click the button, because that button for some reason used the function out of moment.js, I'll end up pulling moment.js when the user clicks the button.
Absolutely. But isn't it better to delay that?
Oh yeah, but on the other hand, there's a risk that I might not notice because my tests don't actually click the button or something.
There will always be ways to to shoot yourself in the foot, right?
So maybe like a warning, like, hey, you need to notice that a certain bundle is, maybe too large or something like that.
So that's what kind of comes with the $, right? Like these are the implicit kind of rules and understanding, right? And that's why we chose to make the $, so explicit, because once you use Qwik, for building the real applications, you kind of understand like, oh, this $, has these set of rules, but also these set of implications. And it's nice when it's explicit. When I'm kind of telling you as a the developer, you're basically being told like, magic's happening here. It's a well-defined box, right? It's not like complicated magic. It's a well-defined box of what's happening in here, but you have to be aware that this is what's happening.
There's another topic that I wanted to bring up, which we kind of touched on before we started recording, and we said we might want to talk about, which is you mentioned Qwik and Qwik City. So I think that for some of our listeners, at least, the distinction between these two might not be clear. So can you kind of explain, like, do I have to use Qwik City if I use Qwik, or can I use Qwik without Qwik City? Where does one end and the other begin? Why is this distinction even being made?
So there are two things. So Qwik City is the meta framework, whereas Qwik is the framework, right? And the way I think about it is, Qwik is basically everything that goes with or inside of the component $, right? So when I'm declaring my components, the JSX, the use methods, etc., all of those things really fundamentally are the Qwik, not Qwik City. And if you think about it, the Qwik can run as a regular client-side application, right? A pure CSR, right? Qwik has that ability. Like we always tout its SSR capabilities, but there's nothing stopping you from using it as a regular good old client-side rendered application. So that's what Qwik is. Qwik City then deals with things related to the server. So whether it's fetching data, whether it's routing at the server level, or doing things as like RPCs.
So the routing is part of Qwik City.
Yeah, the routing is part of Qwik City, but it has this interesting property that it can actually run both places. It can run either on the Qwik City side, or it can run in the client as well. So it's kind of a both. So the whole MPA versus SPA kind of gets really muddy.
So here's the thing, though. I recently did a conference talk where I compared the performance of various frameworks, or more accurately, the likelihood that you'll build a performant website using any of the frameworks. So I basically looked at the ratios of websites having good performance built using any of the frameworks. And when I looked at meta frameworks, I actually included Qwik, as it were, as a meta framework, because from my perspective, it's highly unlikely that anybody will decide to actually use Qwik and not use it with the SSR capabilities that are associated with it. So theoretically, there are a lot of organizations using React without any meta framework. Currently, only approximately something like 13% of all React websites out there actually use some official quote unquote meta framework. Most of them are just maybe client-side rendered or whatever. There's a good question whether this will persist going forward, as it seems that Next.js is the future of React. But that's the situation right now, and therefore that's why I kind of question the need for this distinction in the context of Qwik, because I'm asking myself, why would I ever use Qwik without Qwik City?
Well, okay,
I'll give you an example.
Can I defend a little bit? Actually,
yeah, go.
I mean, there's solid and there's solid start, which is very similar. There's Vue has its Vue, and then I think there's a router that is independent.
Vue and Nux.
Yeah. So everyone has this kind of thing.
Yeah, but
and
for
different
reasons, though, by the way. We can, and anyway, I'm kind of, we're pulling the discussion in a different direction. We want to focus on Qwik.
What if we didn't make a distinction? What if we put both things together? And let's say then you want to use Qwik to build a something that's purely client-side rendered, such as a Chrome extension. Then what? What do you do with Qwik City?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So you need to basically have a way of not shipping Qwik City, because in this particular context, it might be that there is no server, right? Like if it's a Chrome extension or Chrome DevTools extension, there is no server. And so what would you do then?
We actually it recently came out, an episode where we interviewed Kyle Simpson, Getify, talking about the company is currently working at Socket Supply. The reason that I'm bringing it up is they're doing a really interesting peer-to-peer thing where there are no servers. It's all clients talking to each other without any servers. It's all peer-to-peer. So yeah, I guess in that context, it makes, in the context of something like that, or like you said, Chrome extensions, it makes a lot of sense. But it still seems to me like that the sweet spot, the where you guys are mostly promoting Qwik, I think, it's the benefit of when it is used with a server.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the biggest benefit. Yes.
So Misko, let me ask you, one of the examples that I think of when you talk about separation of client side versus server side is an app, say that's just an administrative app. You don't give a rip about server side rendering or SEO because it's behind a login. I've been working on one myself here for the past few months. And so is that something that, based on what Dan was just describing about the whole reason for Qwik, or a lot of it, unless I'm misunderstanding, is to have that synchronization and quickness, no pun intended, between, actually I did intend it.
They intended it when they came up with
resumability between the back end and the front end. Is that even a valid use case for something like Qwik, where you only need the client side rendering? And if so, why?
How many times have you had this thing where there's somebody in your company sends you a link to clearly something that is internal to the company, right? Like a customer management system or something like that, right? And then you look at that link and you go like, do I want to click on that? Because I know clicking on it is going to give 10 seconds of my life to me waiting for the spinner for the app to come, right? And so even internally inside of the organization where there is no benefit to SEO or any of that stuff, wouldn't it be nicer if the apps just came up faster? Right? Like, yeah, we amortize the cost of the fact that Gmail is super slow to come up over the fact that it runs the whole day. But what if it would be instant come on? What if I don't have to keep the window open because the cost of navigating back to Gmail is essentially the same cost as opening up a Google search? Like, you don't keep Google search open, right? Because there's nothing to amortize. There is no cost to closing the Google search and then opening in a new tab whenever you feel like. Whereas you keep Gmail open primarily because there is a cost to it.
And I'll add to that very often, the fact that these kind of apps have really poor performance is justified by the fact that it's not worth the effort. But if there is no effort, if you get the good performance for quote unquote free, then everybody wins.
And this is kind of the big thing that Qwik is trying to kind of get across, is that as a developer, you should be focusing on building the behavior of the app, not worrying about like how to make it performant, right? To us, the basic philosophy of Qwik is to basically say that performance is not your problem. It is our problem. We are taking it on, right? And that is not how it is in other frameworks. If you think about how other frameworks have, is they have APIs to make your code faster, right? You build your app, and then there are best practices or whatever you do to kind of improve the performance to make it go fast, right? And our argument is like, that's not a thing that should exist.
Well, you're not alone. One of the things I'm a big proponent of is inertia JS, and that does a lot of what you describe. It handles the browser communication between your chosen front end and your back end, and it's smoking fast. I've been amazed about how fast it is. And I didn't have to do anything. All I do is I write my back end code, I write my front end code. Inertia handles the browser interaction between the front and the act and hijacking the post request and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's another similar tool, to my mind that does the same thing that you're talking about. Obviously, there's some different tools and things that you're using, but the end result is still the same.
Yeah, I think we're in this world right now where if the website is slow, we blame the developer. We're like, oh, it's their fault. They messed up, right? But I think that's the wrong world. I think we should be in a world when the website is slow. We should be like, no, the tooling messed up. The tooling allowed the developer to end up in the wrong place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm reading a great book right now called Design of Everyday Things.
Right? Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And in the book, like the guy makes an excellent point, which is like,
doors, lots and lots of doors.
Doors too. But, like when there's an airplane crash, like you can look at it as like, oh, human error. Like, yeah, but like, why did the system crash? Because humans are predictably error prone, right? So like, why did you design a system so that like a single human error like caused the crash?
Well, there's a whole rabbit trail we could go down, considering I was just reading a report of a well-known crash in Hawaii that happened a few years ago. It was on Hacker News about a cargo plane that had crashed. And the whole point of the report was how the human interactions prior to the flight and during the flight was what caused it. There were processes, everything's in place. They didn't follow them. So, whether it was checklists, whether it was trusting the other person too much, and not relying on the stuff that was in place. So that might be sort of a rabbit trail. But to your point, yes, a lot of times you blame the person. Oh, they screwed up. Somebody did something wrong. But at the same time, a lot of times you're saddled by the infrastructure. With browsers, what are we saddled with? We're saddled with the post request and how it works and the interaction and all the caching and things you have to develop, rely on if you're doing server-side rendering stuff, which is what you're trying to address. And so we're constantly coming up with tools to overcome the infrastructure and the tools we have in place, partially because if you look at the time that these tools were developed, they had a very small goal in mind. We want to make documents available on the web. They didn't give a rat's patootie about performance because a lot of that wasn't an issue at the time. And so because of the way things were initially developed and because of all the technical debt you have on relying on those things for so many years, now you're developing tools to try to overcome it. Whereas, hindsight's 2020, right? If we were to look back at this point and say, okay, if I'm starting over with the World Wide Web and Tim Berners-Lee is still, creating the web browser or Brandon's still doing JavaScript, whatever, we would do it completely different.
Yeah.
Now we have technologies that would allow us to do things much quicker and much easier and faster.
So here's the thing. I remember a talk from a long time ago by Ellen Kay, the amazing Ellen Kay. And if you guys don't know who that is, you should, or our listeners, you should immediately, like at the end of this podcast, drop everything and check out the stuff that he's done over the years. Creator of Smalltalk, just to start. He basically invented the concept of object-oriented programming. And he was really annoyed with the web as an application platform. And I remember from something like 15 years ago, he tried to propose an alternative distributed application development platform. And he showed how much more amazing it was and so on and so forth. But, what are we using today? we're using the web, not the amazing thing that LNK envisioned and designed. So, in retrospect, going back, maybe Tim Berners-Lee and Brendan Eich would have built something else, but maybe that thing would have failed. We've got what we've got. But going to the concept of performance, of getting performance for quote unquote free out of the framework or the platform, we've been primarily focusing about performance as in startup performance or loading performance. What about execution performance? Is that something where Qwik is providing value as well when compared to frameworks such as, I don't know, like React or Vue?
I think so. I think so as well. I think the framework that kind of showed the way here is Solid.js, right? Solid.js with signals basically showed like, hey, we can do a lot better in terms of rendering once the application is running. And in that sense, Qwik also uses signals. Now, there are the differences where I was jokingly say, and Ryan Carniato loves it, that basically I say like, Solid is basically the absolute extreme. If you take signals to its absolute extreme, you get Solid, right? And so in that sense, I think Solid.js will continue to be one of the fastest frameworks out there in terms of runtime performance, right? But I want to point out that people have successfully been building apps even with not so performant frameworks, and it's fine. They can kind of pull it off. It just requires a lot of work, right? And so while I think runtime performance is super important, and I think with Qwik, you maybe get like 95% to that of Solid, but you don't get as much as Solid. The thing that Qwik has going for it is the startup performance, right? The bundling, dealing, etc. Because Solid, while it may perform really well once it's up and running, still has the same problems of the startup performance, getting all the bundles downloaded, no easy way to do code splitting and all of those things, right? So there's a separate kind of a category of things. And so there's also a trade-off that you have is like the more fine-grained you make the reactivity, the more data you have to serialize, which makes it harder to do resumability, right? And so like between these trade-offs, we are actually obviously because it's our baby, but like we feel like we're in a very good spot where we made a good trade-off between, hey, we have resumability and therefore we don't need all that stuff. We can lazy load everything we want. But at the same time, we're also pretty darn close to what Solid is in terms of signals and updating the UI.
So we've had Ryan Cognato on the show talking several times about fine-grained reactivity and signals. So I encourage our listeners to check that out if they're interested in the topic. But just to give a really brief overview, basically the main contrast here is between systems like Solid or like Qwik, which use the concept of fine-grained reactivity, which means that when a particular value changes, that value triggers that change triggers a mutation of the relevant part of the DOM. And contrast that with systems like React, which take a more immutable type of an approach, where you generate the entire state that you want as a virtual DOM, hand it over to the framework, and the framework reconciles the difference. That's like the main distinction here, right? And you're kind of quote unquote forced into using fine-grained reactivity because it's kind of tied to the way in which you deliver down the code. That you only deliver the code that is needed to perform the mutation that needs to happen.
Yeah, so you're forced down this route because let's take React as an example. Let's take a classical example where you have a buy button and a shopping cart. And a buy button and a shopping cart are far apart in terms of the DOM, right? And so there's some parent that has both of these two, and this parent is pretty close to root. And so that's the parent where you store your state of what the current shopping cart state is, right? And so now the problem becomes that if you mutate the shopping cart, if the buy button mutates the shopping cart, then the way it works in React is that you start with the component where the state is declared, which is pretty close to the root, and you start re-rendering everything. Which means like resumability, you fought all of this effort to make sure that you don't download the JavaScript code, and you went through all these hoops to kind of make sure that this doesn't have to eagerly execute. And the first time you click a button, bam, your whole application has to show up. because you have to re-render the whole thing, right? And so the fine-grained reactivity is the escape hatch for this, right? It basically says, actually, you don't need to re-render all this stuff because fine-grained reactivity allows you to connect the buy button directly to either the shopping cart or directly to the shopping cart's DOM elements, right? And so if you make that connection that's like so fine-grained, then you can skip over all of the code that lives in between. And that's the point. It's like you're not forced to it, but if you don't do it, then you are very quickly in the world of hurt, right? And so it's not like it's a hard requirement, but it's a pretty good idea not to go there.
But just to give a balanced viewpoint, there are people who prefer the React approach because it kind of avoids the coupling that exists between the state and the updates. Like you basically re-render the whole approach of re-rendering everything on any change makes the system potentially or often less performant or less optimized in terms of performance, but simpler to grasp in terms of state transitions.
I'm not sure I agree with that. So there is definitely a set of rules that you have to follow with signals. So the way I would state it is that if you don't use signal, if you use the React model, there are fewer places where you will be surprised in terms of like you lose reactivity, right? Because if you basically re-render the whole world all the time, then it's really hard to do something where the React will not notice because it's rerunning the whole world anyways, and so it will notice, right? So I think the trade-off you have is that when you go with signals, there are new set of rules that you have to follow. Just like if you use the use methods, use hooks, right? There are certain rules that you have to understand as a developer. Like you can't just put the use hooks anywhere. There's a specific order. You can't put them in the loops. You can't have an if statements, right? These are a set of rules that you learn as a developer and you know to follow them. And so signals also comes with these set of rules. And if you don't follow them, bad things will happen. And so I think the way I would phrase it is that if you use signals, you are more constrained about the rules that you have to follow, right? And so when you use something that doesn't use signals like React, you are more free. You can do more things and you can get away with more things, right? But the trade-off is if you're willing to be more constrained, and again, I'm going to argue that like these constraints are just like the use methods, use hooks. After a while, you don't even think about it. It's so natural, right? But if you're willing to be more constrained, then as a benefit, as a trade-off, you will get this performance benefit, right? And so I think it's a trade-off that's worth having because especially for humans, we take complexity, but after a while we internalize it so well that we don't even think about putting the use method behind an if statement, right? Or, inside of a for loop or et cetera. Like after a while, it just becomes second nature. We just don't even think about it. And so it's the same thing with signals. They're definitely more complicated. There's more rules. There's things you have to learn to use them. But once you do, it's just natural and you get all these benefits.
So unless people object, I want to pull our conversation while we still have some time to a different direction, one that is slightly less technical or totally not technical, but has to do a lot with the potential success of Qwik. It seems to me that a big factor for the current success of React was that at a certain point in time, they got all the boot camps to teach React. That if you go through a boot camp, there's a good chance that you learn some basic DOM, some basic JavaScript, just enough to learn React, and then they taught you React. And consequently, when you get to your first job, React is what you know how to do. And also employers, may prefer React because they know they can get people who know React to work on their projects. How will you be able to, how are you looking to, circumvent, to like address this? Like, do you foresee boot camps teaching Qwik instead of React? How will you elicit this transition?
So I think the thing that React got right is the simplicity of it, right? I don't know if it was intentional or not. I'm assuming it was, but like the way JSX is written, the way React has went through many iterations. They were class-based first, but now they're function-based, right? The thing that I really value from the React side of things and JSX side of things is just how simple it is in terms of explaining. Like, there is a set of rules, and it's relatively easy to explain. And I think the reason why React kind of won for over, and why a lot of people end up in there, and again, bootcamps as well, is because if it's simple set of rules, then it's easy to explain, right? And it's easy. The ramp is very shallow in terms of what you need to know in order to get going. Now, over time, the ramp gets, not that it gets steeper, but like you get higher and higher because, at some point you have to do styling and animation and lazy loading and suspense, and things get complicated. And that's true for any framework. But the starting point is very shallow. And, you basically just need a function with JSX and a render call, and voila, you're off to go, right? And you can kind of build from there. And I think that's a really, really good property that I think AngularJS had that property, but then Angular lost it. We can go into the rabbit hole why that is, but I think Angular lost it. And I think this is kind of what enabled React to kind of really take off and flourish, is because they continually to have this really shallow ramp. And so in Qwik, we really are focusing on this a lot. We want to make sure that the ramp, the starting thing, is pretty shallow, and you can easily get started and get going. And so one of the things that the Qwik is, if you look at it, is that it mimics React very closely. And this isn't an accident. That's both a consequence of the fact that Qwik uses JSX, but also consequence of the fact that, like, hey, we think this is a better way of doing this. If this better way of doing this also requires that you have to change your complete tooling to everything, it's going to be a steep thing, right? But if you already know React, and really you just have to like learn a couple of new things, like you just have to learn signals and a $, and then you're good to go. And oh, by the way, even if you don't really know how signals and $sign works, even if you know nothing about the set of rules, you'll probably be able to go pretty long time before you like do something to kind of fall off the cliff, so to speak, right? So you can get away with a lot of things and very little knowledge. So I think Qwik has the right property of being simple to kind of get started, and many things just kind of happen as you develop bigger and bigger applications.
Interesting. I do have to say one thing about React simplicity, or supposed simplicity. So I spoke at a recent React Next conference. At the end of the conference, we had this sort of question. The audience played a game where they got asked questions, and the winner got a prize, and something like $500. And I contributed some of the questions to that contest. And one of the questions was, how many built-in hooks does React have? Not, custom hooks or hooks introduced by third-party libraries, but ones actually built in to the core framework. Do you know?
I'm going to guess around 15.
You're absolutely correct.
I was going to guess 11.
Exactly, 15. So how can React be super simple if it's got 15 built-in hooks?
Well, yeah, like a few of them are for library authors.
Yeah,
honestly, I think like 7 of them are for library authors.
Yeah, but that means that 8 are actually needed, and that's still a lot.
Yeah, but like the thing is, like if you don't have a problem at hand that requires the specific hook, you don't need to know about that hook, right? So you can go a lot.
Yeah, just use affect everything.
Oh no, God, no.
You're laughing, but like I'm sure a lot of people do.
Oh yeah. I mean, I will say that the mental model of that stuff. I teach this a lot, and I have long videos on literally just use effect, and people don't get it. It's really hard. And I actually think that it was interesting. A lot of people actually prefer, not a lot, I don't know, whatever, some representative number, still prefer classes because they just actually, for the mental model, I think is just a little bit easier for them.
When Ryan kind of pushed Solid, one of the selling points was no use effect.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a huge foot gun. And it's just lying out there, right?
We started in Qwik. We started with use effect, but then over time we decided to rename it, differentiate it, specifically because there's enough differences between it, and there's enough foot guns that we wanted to kind of make it clear to the developers. Not the same thing. It's different. I know you're thinking the same thing, but it's not.
What did it become?
Well, there's use task and use visible task and use resource and use computed. These are all different kind of use cases for the same kind of a thing. It seems like it's more, but it's actually easier because like this is used for this category.
Yeah,
this is
absolutely.
used for this category.
Yeah, for sure. That makes more sense. Yeah.
Alrighty, I'll jump in here. We're hitting about an hour, so we need to start wrapping up. Before we move on to picks, any last things that we missed that you want to mention real quick, Misko?
Quick.
Sorry, I really didn't intend that pun. It just worked out. I'm just so good. I'm just so good at it that it comes naturally.
You know what?
Naturally.
I don't even know how to spell the word quick anymore. Like when I write it outside of quick context, I'm like, did I spell it right?
Being the child of the 70s and 80s, when I first hear that, I think of Nestle Quick and the rabbit and the whole,
But it's not spelled
song.
The same way, right? It's spelled differently.
I think it's Qwik. I have to look it up, but
no.
Yeah, that's how I remember it. So anyway,
I know I had like a Quickie Mart in my.
It's Qwik.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, otherwise you would have had like a trademark issue with Nestle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right. So, all righty. Well, thank you for coming on again, Misko. Thank you, Jack, for joining us as well.
Glad to be here.
With that, we'll move on to picks. Picks are the part of the show where we get to talk about anything we want, within reason, of course. Doesn't have to be tech related. Can be anything: books, movies, food, you name it. So we'll start with AJ today. What do you got for us, AJ?
Well, I've been playing Tears of the Kingdom. I spent about 20 hours over the weekend on the Big Poe quest. I don't know
is that the new Zelda game? Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if that's good or bad.
What system are you using for it, by the way?
Switch, probably.
What?
Are you using a Switch?
Well, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think it's the only thing you can use.
Yeah, that's the only thing. It's Nintendo, man. We're not PC gamers over here. Zelda's not a PC game. Where have you been at? You're too old, man. You gotta give it the time.
Let's put it this way. I don't know how many of I actually worked in the video gaming industry for a while. How many here can say that? That being said, I'm actually totally not a gamer. I don't know. I just don't enjoy it that much, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm not a gamer either. I only own Nintendo.
So I only own Nintendo and spend countless hours on it, but I'm not a gamer.
It's been a very long time since I've sunk time into a game. So yes, I am a Zelda-er. When a Zelda comes out, I will probably sink some time into it. And Tears of the Kingdom, I don't know. It's such an addicting game. I don't know if that makes it a great game. I really like it, but I'm also. It's been 10 years. I want. Has it been 10 years? I think it's been 10 years. I want a Triforce and iron boots and left-handed sword. and a green tunic. I'm hoping that the next game. I'm glad that they did Tears of the Kingdom, but I'm hoping that the next game is got a story where you need to finish one thing in order to progress to the next to some degree. They broke the formula a little bit with Link Between Worlds, where you could go to any of the 7 dungeons in any order, but no matter which one you went to, there was something about having an item from one of the previous dungeons that would have helped you in that dungeon had you had it. And so there was still a little bit of I don't know, but Tears of the Kingdom is bittersweet for me. As excellent as it is, I'm craving a traditional Zelda game with Triforce, Rescue the Princess, Boomerang, left-handed sword, and iron boots for good measure. But I'm glad that they made this a greatest hits. They've got the Poe quest. They've got the Qwik. I don't know how you say it. The 3-headed dragon that hasn't been in the game since the original game in the like 85 or 87 or whatever it was. So, but apparently they beat every record for game sales. They did something like 10 million sales in the first weekend, so it's the most that any game has ever sold ever. And it's great, but it's hard to pick a path. It's like they want you to be ADD, which I guess is great because the generation of children raised on phones, that's all they know how to do. No offense to everyone that I obviously just offended.
So you're saying that there's the point in the game where what's his name, Link, basically pulls out the mobile phone and starts walking around the world, ignoring everything and just looking at his phone.
That actually is part of the game.
I was gonna say that's like Final Fantasy, but okay.
All right, is that your pick, AJ? Is that what you got?
Yeah, that's my
well, he's got
my bittersweet pick.
He doesn't have time for anything else.
That's what it sounds like for sure. I could see your wife and your kids, Daddy. No, I'm sorry, I'm playing Zelda, man. I'll get to you later.
Sometimes.
All right, Dan, your turn. What do you got for us?
Yeah, mine is not that much fun, and it's less a pick than an unfortunate observation, statement of a situation. So at the time of this recording, the Israeli government is starting to pass a set of laws that are going to transform us from a vibrant democracy into something that's starting to look more like a government, which is not a democracy and more starting to look like some sort of dictatorship. Maybe not quite yet, but not a democracy either. And the legitimate elected government into an illegitimate regime. And as a result, tomorrow, with a lot of other Israelis, I'll be doing a lot of demonstrating in the streets. And hopefully we'll make it back home safely by the end of the day. We will see. And that's my unfortunate observation for today.
Okay, so moving right along with that cheerful note, I'll try to resurrect things with the dad jokes of the week. For those of you who aren't familiar, I offer amazing dad jokes that I receive accolades from all over the world. It's just truly amazing. So first of all, question: why didn't Han Solo, Star Wars for the uneducated, enjoy his steak dinner? It was chewy.
Oh,
that's a gross. I know. Second one. This is more of a piece of advice. Never use a double negative. They're a big no-no. And finally, this is a story from when I was job interviewing a couple years ago. The guy who was interviewing me says to me, "Your resume says you take things too literally." And I said, "When the heck did my resume learn to talk?"
oh.
All righty. So those are the dad jokes of the week. Jack, your turn. What do you got for us for picks?
My pick for the week is Monkey Type. It's a site that you can go to that will help you learn how to type faster and more reliably. And I've been doing it for, I don't know, a couple months. And it slowly kind of builds you towards being a better typist. And I mean, I learned to type when I was 12 or something like that. And it was just terrible. So I started to learn some better habits and become a more reliable typist, which is certainly helpful when you're doing a lot of screencasts.
Yeah, if there's one thing that I'm kind of annoyed with the school system, and it seems to be the case in the school systems of essentially almost every country, is that they don't teach touch typing. And I just don't understand why. It seems like such a useful skill to have.
In my generation, they did, but they did it with Selectrics, which were insanely loud typewriters back in the day.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that part of my hearing loss is because of huge rooms full of Selectrics going bang, bang, bang every time that, anybody typed.
Yeah, that was one class that I never took. It was an elective. And I wished I had, because I've started to learn to type by necessity, and it's not the prettiest thing. Monkey type. Alrighty, and last but not least, Misko.
Well, I kind of already mentioned it, but I'm going to say it again. Reading the book called Design of Everyday Things. Highly recommended. Super interesting. Yeah, there is a whole section, a chapter about how doors are messed up, which I think is hilarious. But it does kind of point correctly at the idea of like, hey, like we should do a better job designing it. There's lots of constraints to consider. And the fact that when we design things that are not obvious to use and people kind of feel dumb because like, I don't know how to use this particular device, it's not probably an issue with you. It's probably an issue with the device and how it was designed. And I think there's a lot of learning. And actually, a lot of these learnings actually go to frameworks as well, which is that, you want to design systems so that the easy way of using it or the most obvious way of using it is the correct way of using it. And we're not there yet. I think we have a lot of improvements to do.
I think it's excellent that somebody who's so involved in the framework world, in the building of frameworks, has this mentality. I think that we constantly seems to be that we strive to make the developer experience easier and simpler. And certainly, a lot of videos that Jack does show how quickly you can create really sophisticated things, but at the same time, it also shows that a lot of these things are still pretty complex and require a lot of knowledge in order to get right.
Yeah, I think framework authors sometimes that's their job all day long, every day is to build this framework, and so they live in this kind of ethereal world, like functional programming and this and that. And when it comes to actual like boots on the ground, people building an e-commerce site, right? What does an effect mean? What is that? What is that? And so that there's this kind of disconnect, and and you end up needing people that kind of teach and build that bridge between those things. And it would just be a whole lot easier if the framework authors were kind of in the world of actually using their frameworks kind of daily, and so they could just see that those are the issues, and being in Discord and seeing people ask like, what the heck is this? Well, I don't even understand, because I'm my God, I have a lot I could teach some framework authors about like how these things are used.
Yeah. It's interesting when you talk about design, there's a couple things, that sort of strike me. Misko, you mentioned the book about everyday things. My wife was watching a news piece from CBS this morning, the other day. I think it was last night that I happened to see it. And it was talking about how we design roadways and sidewalks in such a way that they prevent pedestrian deaths and automobile accidents. And there's so many little things that you don't think about when you see a road. The one example that stands out to me from this particular piece was like having space between the sidewalk and the street, right? So you have a little bit of a buffer, if something, a car goes off the road or something like that. Little things like that you normally don't think about, but when you start looking at it, it's design. And I think the other thing of design that's always struck me, as I mentioned that earlier, is when you're designing, are you designing to fix an issue right now and address that issue right now? Or are you designing in such a way that you can do that and also think down the road, okay, is this design going to be a short-term fix? But if I was to design for ways that people might possibly use something, how am I going to design it? Is it going to be totally different? One of the things that I think that people don't appreciate that was designed in such a way that has certainly had very long-term use is the IP system, IP addresses. That was designed, late 60s, early 70s? Mm-hmm. And to this day, it's still the way the internet is addressed, right? And we had to go from IP4 to IPv6 just because of there's so much use of the system, but it's worked for so long, and it was fortunately designed in such a way that it was able to be somewhat future-proof, right? And so for people that are designing and trying to think ahead, if you can get it right, hey, my hat's off to you, because that's got to be very difficult to be able to do something that addresses a need, but also future-proofs it for down the road. So that's the end of my rambling and babbling. Thank you again, Misko and Jack, for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you.
Happy to be here.
And we will talk to y'all next time on JavaScript Jabber.
Bye.